last century. He went to Harvard, and they basically told him that, you know, black people have no history, they have no contribution to the world, they don't show up in the literature. And Du Bois said, all right, you think so? Well, I'll go write the history, I'll write the literature, and they'll show up. Just give me a minute. And he spent his entire life doing that. He was a founder of the NAACP, the editor of the Crisis magazine. He had this notion of getting together all the knowledge in the world on Africans and having the Encyclopedia Africana. But he didn't sort of gripe about it. He got it, and if it wasn't there, he put it in place. And in my view, there's very little time to sort of worry about what's not there. I think one has to make what is not there and sort of join with others to keep that there while you add to. I think another great inspiration to me is Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey came to this country and looked around and said, you know, black man, where is the big black things? Where's your big building? Where are your big boats? Where are your neighborhoods? And Garvey, in a profound way to me, put a challenge to Africans in America to, seize the time and exert the power that you have. And that power is that power that you declare you have often and can organize to have. Another tremendous muse for me certainly has been James Baldwin. James Baldwin did a profound thing. He stood up in America and said who he was. And in my opinion, has been one of our most extraordinary intellectual figures in the world. He did worldwide thinking. He broke it down. He said, you know, white people, there are no white people. You mean to tell me that the Englishman and the Greek man are the same? White is a state of mind. And all these people become white by coming here. They sort of transform. And I think his intellectual analysis let us know that, you know, there is nothing the matter with the black brain. It can work, and it is capable of profound analysis. Better analysis than most other people because we have endured many things that others have not. And last but not least, my one favorite person locally is a woman named Ruth Batson, who has been an extraordinary youth. And what I love about her is that I have any question, and I'm not sure or want an opinion, I can sit down with Ruth, present it to her, and she will say something to me like, not good enough. And it's an inspiration to me to know that I can have someone who will tell me the truth about some important issue facing people in our midst. So those are several. I could go on and on about people in art and literature, but I think those, if I have a short time, will be the ones I'd name.
Toye Brown, Mel, or Eva?
It's interesting that you mentioned Ruth. I told her once that if there was a person that I, at that point, would like my daughters to know and to see in terms of her approach to dealing, it was Ruth. I start with my mother and father, who struggled in the 30s and 40s. My father died when I was 13, and my mother really struggled. And it was interesting that when she died at 82, there was a big church gathering for the celebration of her life. And one of the things that she said during the street insurrections had to do with the fact that some of the young people, or some people, burnt a clothing store, which a cleaners, which the people whose clothes were in there were all black folks. And so from a political perspective, there was something fundamentally wrong with the fact that they would do that. The other piece, she would say, well, with all your mouth, can you get the streets clean? And I would always remember that. With all your mouth, can you get the streets clean? The role my father played was one in which he would always say that you don't bother anybody, but if they bother you and they're bigger than you, you have a right to pick up a stick. And so he was very, very, very political, very analytical, and when he died, it was on Pearl Harbor Day. I remember he was buried on Pearl Harbor Day. I remember the people who came to the house, and particularly the men that he worked with. He was a secretary to the Longshoremen Union, which was a black local here in Boston, was saying that he could not say the things that he said about this country now that we were at war, because he had a very, very strong political view about this country, its racism, and its way of dealing with people. But because he was in the union, he always used to tell me about the organizing efforts. And so I kind of got a sense of the importance of organizing and his role there. Let me just say quickly that the other folks who I have as models, Paul Robeson, who I heard for the first time not too far from here, over on Washington Street. Adam Clayton Powell, who was, I think, bar none, the most effective elected official anywhere, anytime when it came to dealing with people's needs. Half the programs in agriculture, in food, that you have had to take advantage of have come through Adam Clayton Powell. And then there's Rosa Parks. Rosa, for me, more than even with what I've said about my folks and all, is the person who I believe is the most responsible for even this school and for a lot of things that have happened in this country. We talked about affirmative action. We can talk about any level of access for people who have been oppressed in one way in this society. The most significant person in getting people to deal with that was Rosa Parks. She said, before Martin Luther King, before Jesse Jackson, that she was somebody, she was deserving, and that she had a right, and that if she gave up her seat, it would mean that she thought that she was less than they, and that she understood that fear, and that the greatest fear was not what they could do to her, but what she would feel about herself if she gave up her seat. And that's one of the things that I fundamentally believe that we all have to overcome.
Eva and Toye, please.
I come to this question from the perspective of someone who spends a lot of her time in the academy teaching university students and doing research, and also someone who does a lot of community work. And so I'd say, in addition to my parents as well, I'd focus on W.E.B. Du Bois, who I admire for his independent thinking. not being held to a party line, and also, even though he had the benefit of having had a Harvard degree, he did not abandon his community, he didn't go and live elsewhere, but he lived right up there with 360 degrees of blackness. He made his home with the folks, he made their concerns his concerns, and his whole life was really dedicated to figuring out how intellectual academic analysis could be useful for the lives of the poorest of the poor. And if any of you are not familiar, it's still a classic and it's still worth looking at. It's just brilliant and it's beautiful. The Philadelphia Negro is the state-of-the-art sociological work that Du Bois wrote, and it came out of all this rich analysis from years that he spent among black people. And I think when I look at the breakdown from his generation to what's happened today, I see a real disconnect between blacks who've made it, who've gotten the access, who've gotten the degrees, and they're out, and there's not the engagement, and there's not the concern, the way I think it should be, with what's going on at the grassroots. I'd say a few other people really quickly. Another scholar who has really influenced me for his community work is Noam Chomsky. He's a linguist at MIT. He is a secular Jew, absolutely brilliant, and he was one of the first people to speak out against the Vietnam War because he got it in the early 60s that it was the poorest of the poor, both white and black, who were being sent to fight a war that didn't make a lot of sense. That kind of dissenting intellectual work that that was refused to be kowtowed, refused to give into party lines, and was unpopular in the service of the poorest of the poor, I think is really, really critical. Other people on the more political front would be people like Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the Vietnamese Revolution. I saw a documentary with him, and he said the Vietnamese might lose 1,000 people, a million people in this war with the U.S., but we're going to sacrifice to the end. So that kind of integrity, that kind of collective sacrifice, going back to the comment that someone made about cohesiveness among blacks, that kind of model to me is what really inspires me. And I think that there really are examples in history among both politicians and academics that we can draw from and do something with, and I'll stop.
Number of role models over the years, but I think the issue for me is who was it or what was it or what moment woke me up and got me moving in the direction that I've been in for the last 30-some years. And it was sitting on the grass in Washington, D.C. in 1963, before most of you were born, the March on Washington, with some young people from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, who told me about what they had endured through their lives, what they were enduring in school to get there. And I could not believe that they were living like that and they had lived like that. And then I started looking around at how I was living in Midwest Columbus, Ohio. And from that day on, I was moving. And then my role models started being people like Stokely Carmichael, H. Rap Brown, and Malcolm X. Then one day in New York, after I'd been to graduate school, Mel King was at a program that had been pulled together by somebody by the name of Whitney Young, who was one of my major mentors. And I was looking for a job. I just graduated from Columbia University School of Social Work, and Mel said, "Why don't you come to Boston?" And so I have to say that Mel was one of my major role models.
We're here today mainly as a piece. We have a lot of things on our agenda, and the main piece is that we wanted to get some more feedback on the things that we have going on. We thought politics plays everything into buying a house and having an affordable house, knowing where the club is and where it will be actually a place where African American businesses are, the education system, Boston Public Schools, and how our young African American and Latino kids are educated, and also different ways how people can get involved and things like that. And a question we asked for the panelists and also for the audience is, what are some examples where we have actually slam dunked, meaning that when have we actually won? Where are some great examples of of where the community has woken up and actually been able to effectively affect policy and actually make something really happen.
Raw success, taking that area, the triangle, which is just up the street, and all the housing and the programs that they're doing, the Black Community Center is in the process of being built. And Mr. Enriquez is here, and I know he was intrinsic in that process as well.
Any others out there? Well, we have really gone out there and really did a good job in organizing and getting something across.
For those who don't know, is it possible for the folks who bring up these ideas and success stories to also tell how it happened? How the successes came about, so we can have maybe a model or blueprint?
Yes.
I'd like to talk about two success stories here in Boston. And I would also like to suggest that members of this organization go over to the Globe, go and do some real fact finding, because these things happened before you were born. Most of you were born. One of them was the takeover of the Urban League of Boston by a crazy group of three people: Mel King, Toye Brown, and Bryant Rollins. There's a whole history of Urban League in the Black community, and we moved the Urban League from briefcase carrying industrial relations artists, which were basically folks that got jobs for Black people outside of, broke through and did getting jobs, to grassroots organizing. We came up with the slogan, develop communities through developed people, and that meant a lot of things: getting educated, being employed, working with young people, passing on whatever information, whatever power you get, passing it on to someone else, getting involved in the political process. This all happened in the late 60s during the National Economic Opportunity Act days, or the War on Poverty. From the Urban League of Greater Boston, or the new Urban League of Greater Boston, because we literally took over the Urban League. We changed the board. We moved from downtown Boston onto 100 Warren Street programs. We did everything. And there are a number of organizations, the Urban League movement, Exodus, Metco, all of those programs, the leaders of those programs. Bill Owens became a Black state senator, basically out of the education program that was going on at the new Urban League. Just Mel can tell you all of the programs. And for example, we sat with the dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, who trains most of the superintendents of schools across this country. There was 1 or 2 Blacks annually getting into the Harvard Graduate School of Education. There were 30 to 50 Blacks that went into that program. There are a number of people that use Harvard Graduate School of Education because of that program. We sat with the head of the New England Conservatory of Music and opened up the Conservatory of Music. Got a local musician in those days, went on the faculty there, opened that school up. I mean, at every level. And we also still did some employment stuff, but we started talking to corporations about opening up their boardrooms, about getting managers and that sort of thing. So that was a big success story, and it was all over the papers. And if someone did a survey or fact-finding with the Globe, with the newspapers, I'm sure Mel has files. I still have files. There are other people in the city that have files on that whole movement that occurred in the late 60s, early 70s. And it's something that has to happen again. That's how we got Blacks on the school committee. It was through that whole organization of developing people to develop our community. Another success story was Freedom House. Freedom House was a success story 50 years ago when Otto and Muriel Snowden started, and they were a critical factor in a lot of the change that took place in this town for many years. Ed Brooke actually started his campaign at Freedom House and maintained a lot of his grassroots and his connections even once he went to Washington. There were a lot of important openings, but a lot of what happened at Freedom House prior to 1987 was the one-on-one. In other words, you got one person here. Wayne Budd can tell you about how basically he started at Freedom House. But in 1987, something happened. It was basically the same concept that we had used at the Urban League 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier, and that is the whole idea of, again, develop people through develop communities through develop people. Project Reach was one of the major programs that came out of that. The first home buyer seminars, Sonny Grin Harding, who will be here today, can tell you some of the things that happened there. But we, again, were across the board. The algebra program, Eugene Rivers Church was in Freedom House. 15 different operations going on there, all focused on mobilizing our people. Things in terms of the topic of politics, there are basically two kinds of politics that everybody in this room should get involved in. One is electoral politics, and that's a lot of what we've been talking about this morning. But there's the other kind of political behavior or political activity, which has to do with community leadership. And in many instances, that's where everybody can start. You can join a board of one of the nonprofit community agencies. You can volunteer. You can walk in and ask to see the executive director or a program director and say, what programs do you have here? I want to work with someone. And you can just work at the program level. But what happens is the more you get involved that way, the more you see of, who's calling the shots, how do people get funded, that sort of thing. And then that kind of involvement gives you a kind of knowledge about the community, about because everything you see is not what is real. I mean, there's a lot of stuff happening behind those scenes. And so your community involvement, your community leadership will help you understand those dynamics and get you fired up. Because it's unending. You can give and give, and also every now and then you got to step back and take some deep breaths and deal with that. On the other hand, in terms of electoral politics, you have to register and vote. And we told the folks at Freedom House this at Project Reach, as soon as you hit 18, you have got to register and you've got to vote. You've got to get involved. You've got to participate in that process. The other thing that we have to do in this community is we have to run for office. This young man, you have to run for office, and you just get beat and beat, but you got to get up, shake yourself off, and keep stepping and go forward again. You've got to support other people who are running for office, even if it's $5, $10. You got to politically support them, you got to financially support them, and you got to work. We used to say wealth, wisdom, and work. I mean, you've got to give those three things in this whole process. And, if you're a little timid and you don't want to get out there, but then help somebody else. But folks, we have got to do something about the representation at the local level, at the state level, at our national level. The State House is abominable. It's ridiculous what's going on in this State House. And if you don't believe me, understand this. The state the budget this year is $19 billion. $19 billion. And the state is supposed to be working for the good and the welfare across this commonwealth. The key issues, education, health care, economic, all of the issues that are paramount and a paramount concern in our community. But we can't get a hold of 1/100th of a tenth of that $19 billion. And that's just for operating. That's not the capital projects, because they go back in and bond and bond and bond for all those transportation projects or what have you. You've got to start getting involved in electoral politics so that we can get those resources back to our local communities, back to Blue Hill Avenue, for the streets, all of the boarded up houses in our community. And, then they go and do Orchard Park. I mean, it's disgusting. They tear down an old project and they put up some junk. Why? Because we do not have a critical mass of people involved. And the other thing is, your representative, one representative, two, they can't do it. They have to have backup from masses.
I just wanted to respond to the question that you had posed. Where had we slam dunked it? I think there were three things that I know that definitely I saw made an impact. One was the Million Man March Mobilization Committee. I remember when after Million Man March, Siddiqui and Mel and a group of leaders came back.